From a jazz genius whose greatest songs were quietly credited to another man, to the metal god who came out in the most aggressively macho genre on earth, here are 12 musicians who loved men. Some were erased by history, and some flatly refused to let it happen. A few of them are still complicated, and where they are, I will say so. This one is less about hidden evidence and more about hidden lives. Let us begin. Number 12, David Bowie. I am opening with the most genuinely complicated name on the list, on purpose. In 1972, at the absolute height of his transformation into the alien rock star Ziggy Stardust, David Bowie told a British magazine, flatly, that he was gay. It detonated across the music press. For a mainstream rock star to say that, in that era, was almost unthinkable. But the story did not stay simple. Over the following decades, Bowie revised it repeatedly, at one point calling himself bisexual, and later suggesting the whole declaration had been a mistake that hurt his career in America. So, what was the truth? Honestly, we may never fully know, and Bowie liked it that way. Ambiguity was part of his art. What is beyond doubt is the impact. A global superstar stood up in 1972 and refused to be safely straight. And for a generation of queer kids, that single act of defiance cracked something open. Whatever Bowie was in private, in public, he handed a lot of frightened people permission to exist. Number 11, Little Richard. You cannot tell the story of rock and roll without this man. Little Richard, with his pompadour, his eyeliner, his screaming piano, and that unhinged, joyful voice, is quite literally one of the architects of the entire genre. He called himself the king and queen of rock and roll, and he was not wrong. And from the very beginning, he was flamboyantly, defiantly queer in 1950s America as a black man, which took a kind of courage that is hard to even comprehend now. But his life was also a decades-long war between that truth and his intense religious faith. Again and again, he would embrace his queerness, then publicly renounce it, then embrace it once more. I'm not going to flatten that into a tidy label, because he never lived it as one. What is undeniable is that one of the founding figures of rock and roll was an openly queer black man, right there at the creation, in plain sight, and the sanitized version of rock history spent decades pretending otherwise. Number 10, Billy Strayhorn. If you have ever heard Take the A Train, the swinging tune that became Duke Ellington's signature song, you have heard the work of a man most people have never heard of. His name was Billy Strayhorn, and he was the quiet genius behind an enormous amount of what the world thinks of as the Ellington sound. Strayhorn wrote or co-wrote a staggering body of jazz standards, including the aching masterpiece Lush Life, which he wrote when he was still remarkably young. And here is the remarkable part. He lived as an openly gay black man in mid-century America, at a time when that was almost unheard of, protected partly by his place in Ellington's inner circle. He had a long relationship with a fellow musician, and he was a committed friend and collaborator of Martin Luther King. But because so much of his work went out under Ellington's more famous name, his genius was, for decades, quietly folded into someone else's legend. He is the purest example on this list of erasure by association. The songs survived. The man who wrote them nearly didn't. Number 9, Sylvester. In 1978, a song called You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real became a dance floor anthem that has never really left. The voice on it, a soaring, ecstatic falsetto, belonged to Sylvester, the self-proclaimed queen of disco, and he was one of the first major American stars to be completely, joyfully, unapologetically out. Sylvester did not have a closet to come out of. He performed in sequins and feathers, celebrated his blackness and his queerness as a single glorious thing, and refused every instruction to tone himself down for mainstream success. His two backing singers went on to form the duo behind It's Raining Men. And then AIDS came. Sylvester died of complications from the disease in 1988 at just 41 years old, having spent his final months raising money and awareness even as he was dying. He was a pioneer who paid the ultimate price, and whose sound you can still hear echoing through pop music today. Number 8, Rob Halford. Heavy metal, in the public imagination, is about as macho and straight a genre as music has ever produced. Leather, studs, aggression, and the front of one of its greatest bands, Judas Priest, stood a man they literally called the metal god, Rob Halford, owner of one of the most powerful voices in all of rock. And in 1998, Halford went on television and calmly came out as gay. It was one of the first times a major figure from that hyper-masculine world had ever done so, and he was terrified it would end everything. Instead, something wonderful happened. The fans stood by him, the band got bigger than ever, and it slowly emerged that the whole leather and studs look Halford had helped make the uniform of heavy metal had been borrowed all along from gay leather culture. The single most macho genre in music had been quietly wearing a gay icon's wardrobe for decades and never noticed. Halford just finally said it out loud. Number 7. Ricky Martin. At the end of the 1990s, Ricky Martin exploded into global superstardom. Livin' La Vida Loca was inescapable, and he became the face of an entire Latin pop crossover, one of the biggest male pop stars on the planet. And for years, the biggest open secret in the industry was his sexuality. The pressure on him not to say it was immense. His management, the industry, the expectations of a fan base that had built him into a heartthrob. All of it pushed him towards silence, and for a long time he stayed there. Then, in 2010, Ricky Martin published a simple, direct statement declaring that he was, in his words, a fortunate homosexual man, proud of what he was. He later married and built a family. Coming from the very center of mainstream, heartthrob, radio-friendly pop, at the peak of that kind of fame, it mattered enormously. He showed a global audience that the biggest pop star in the room could be a gay man, and the sky would not fall. Number 6. Frank Ocean. Hip-hop and R&B have, historically, been among the least welcoming corners of the music world when it comes to this subject. So when one of the most acclaimed young artists of his generation quietly changed everything, it landed like a thunderclap. His name is Frank Ocean. In 2012, just before releasing the album that would make him a legend, Ocean posted a heartfelt open letter online, describing how his first real love, years earlier, had been a man. He did not make a spectacle of it. He simply told the truth, in beautiful prose, and let his music speak. And the reaction, in a genre many assumed would reject him, was overwhelmingly one of support from other major artists. Frank Ocean opened a door in a room a lot of people insisted did not have one, and the artists who came after him have walked through it ever since. He changed what was sayable in one of the biggest genres on earth, without ever raising his voice. Number 5. Sam Smith. By the time Sam Smith arrived, the ground had shifted enough that a young British singer could top charts around the world, win a fistful of Grammys and an Academy Award, and be openly queer from essentially the very start of their fame. No dramatic reveal, no years of denial, just an enormously successful artist who was out from the beginning. Smith has been candid and public about being gay and, later, about being non-binary, living that truth on the world's biggest stages, at award shows watched by hundreds of millions. And it is worth pausing on how radical that ordinariness actually is. Everything the earlier names on this list suffered, the hiding, the denials, the careers built on a secret, was aimed, in the end, at making this possible. A world where a queer artist simply gets to be a pop star, out loud, without it being the tragedy of their life. Sam Smith gets to live the freedom the others were denied. Number 4. Lil Nas X. And then there's the artist who did not just walk through the open door, but kicked it clean off its hinges. Lil Nas X started with the biggest song in the world, the record-shattering Old Town Road, and then did something almost no one had ever done. At the very peak of that success, he came out as gay, on his own terms, joyfully, and dared anyone to have a problem with it. What makes him extraordinary is that he then made his queerness the loud, unmissable center of his art, in provocative videos and performances designed specifically to be impossible to ignore or sanitize. Where every other name on this list, for centuries, had their truth hidden, coded, or erased, Lil Nas X built his entire superstardom out of refusing to let that happen to him. He is erasure-proof by design. He looked at the whole long history this channel keeps uncovering, and he made himself the answer to it. Number 3. George Michael. George Michael was one of the defining pop stars of his era, first with Wham and then as a solo artist of staggering global success, the voice behind Careless Whisper and Faith and Freedom. And for years, the world's assumptions about this heartthrob were simply wrong. Michael came out publicly as gay in 1998, and here's what deserves remembering. He had already lost the great love of his life, a man named Anselmo Filippa, to an AIDS-related illness, a devastating grief he carried privately while continuing to perform for the world. After coming out, he refused to be ashamed, becoming a fierce advocate and, it later emerged, a staggeringly generous and largely secret donor to causes including HIV and AIDS charities. He gave away fortunes and told almost no one. When he died on Christmas Day in 2016, the scale of that hidden generosity finally came to light. He had spent his life giving quietly in exactly the way the world had once forced him to love. Number 2, Elton John. He's one of the best-selling recording artists in the entire history of music. The glasses, the piano, the impossible run of songs, Rocket Man, Tiny Dancer, Your Song, that have soundtracked the lives of billions of people. Elton John is simply one of the most famous musicians who has ever lived. And he spent the early part of that colossal career carefully managing the truth, first coming out as bisexual in the 1970s, at real risk to his commercial peak, before later living openly and proudly as a gay man. He turned his fame into one of the most effective forces for good in the fight against AIDS, raising and giving away eye-watering sums through his foundation at a time when many of his peers stayed silent. He married the man he loves and became a father. But for all his fame and all his freedom, Elton John belongs at number 2, not number 1, because there is one man on this list who never got the years Elton did, whose truth the world only fully embraced after it was too late to tell him. Number 1. He is, for a great many people, simply the greatest frontman in the history of rock and roll. The voice of one of the biggest bands the world has ever known. The man who, in a single 20-minute set at a stadium concert watched by nearly 2 billion people, is said to have delivered the finest live performance in the history of popular music. There is almost no one on earth who has not heard him sing. His name was Freddie Mercury. And behind the towering, fearless, larger-than-life performer was a man who spent his entire career unable to tell the world the simple truth of who he loved. Mercury had relationships with both women and men, and for the last years of his life shared his home and his heart with a man named Jim Hutton. The two of them wore wedding rings, though no law in their country would let them marry. Hutton stayed at his side to the very end. And here is the end. Mercury was diagnosed as HIV positive in the late 1980s, and he kept it secret, hounded by tabloids, denying the rumors, protecting the people he loved. He kept performing and recording even as the illness wasted him, racing to make as much music as he possibly could while there was still time. And then, on the 23rd of November, 1991, he finally released a short public statement confirming that he had AIDS. He died the following day. He gave the world the truth about his life exactly one day before he left it. He had spent decades as one of the most watched human beings on the planet, and he was only able to be fully honest about who he was with 24 hours left on the clock. The whole planet mourned him, and in mourning him, millions of people were forced, for the first time, to grieve a gay man they had adored without ever knowing it. His death did more to change how the world saw this disease, and these lives, than almost anything before it. Even in erasing himself right up to the final hours, Freddie Mercury, in the end, made himself impossible to erase. Every one of them was handed the same choice between the music and the truth, and the ones who came last are the only reason it is finally possible to keep both.